Well, normally I would have wanted to do this on just an episode of the podcast. This week and next week's episodes are interviews that are already done and in the can, and I didn't want to edit them by throwing this on top of it and deter from the interviews themselves. But I also just didn't want to let a couple of weeks go by and then, mention this later. And I don't know, I guess maybe that wouldn't matter a whole lot, but the way the internet goes and the way information flies, like everything, I guess we'll all be just moving on soon enough, but something happened that hit me hard enough. I just wanted to take a couple of minutes and share some thoughts. Way back before podcasting was a thing, when I was a kid, media back then was pretty much just television, films, books, magazines, and radio. And my geekery, my nerddom for TV and film and music started pretty early in my teen years. And I would read interviews in magazines, or I would find different programming through PBS or cable if I was lucky enough to have it, with MTV and stuff like that, or documentaries or live concert videos or whatever, and find interviews of people that I looked up to, people that I respected, people that I wanted to learn from. And prior to my eventually finding podcasting, which happened probably about 10 years ago for me, one of the sources of a variety of interviews that just really grabbed my attention and really piqued my interest and got me really even deeper into film and acting and directing and all those things that now I have a whole feature of my podcast, The Drive Home, revolving around, was a show on Bravo called Inside the Actors Studio. As I understand it, the Actors Studio is a school in New York that teaches acting, film acting, theater acting, you name it. And apparently it's even some level of a club where, lots of famous actors and actresses, Robert De Niro, Meryl Streep, etc., are members of the Actors Studio. At some point, the dean of the Actors Studio, James Lipton, I don't know if it was before he turned it into a television program, but as a part of their master's program, he would sit down with directors and actors and actresses, people with long careers or maybe just profound careers, and he would just do kind of a just an interview spanning their life. How did they get to where they got, and just talking to him about some of their more major projects over the years, and a whole audience, but students. This was part of their curriculum, part of the program, for them to sit down and just listen to the greats tell their story. At some point in the history of that program, since that type of programming would probably interest a bigger audience than just the scholastic audience there, it got picked up by the cable network Bravo and became, I'm not sure how often it was broadcast, but a series. And I mean, he talked to anybody from like Marlon Brando to, I don't know, you name it, like just the history of film and television professionals. So I found the show. YouTube wasn't as big as it is now, but it was pretty big at the time. And I don't remember if I found the show through YouTube or if I found it on actually Bravo, just like, channel surfing and just landing on the show. But I do remember being really captivated by it almost immediately. Before sharing a few more thoughts, just to make this entire thing relevant, and why am I saying all of this, I found out via the internet this morning that James Lipton, the dean of the Actors Studio and the host of that show, as far as I know, for its entire run, which I'm not even sure how long it was, passed away this morning at 93 years old. And part of the reason that was so impactful for me is because, I just enjoyed the program, and I thought he really did a great job at creating space for these artists to open up about their craft and about their vision and about their genius, and also just to open up as people and to kind of share their stories and their history with everyone present, and to be there with him, and just kind of the vibe that they could create with James. Listening to him engage with these artists over the years, and watching his own passion for what all of these people do, and his own fandom and his own geekery, watching him geek out on people was so delightful for me personally, and it just made me relate to him to the point that what I do today as a podcast, a Gaia Karna podcast, and when I sit down with people and do interviews, a lot of the way that I conduct those interviews is pretty tied to watching James Lipton for all those years sit down with. Basically, it's like when I sit down with these people, a lot of them I respect, and I'm very nervous to talk to them because, I want to create some of that same space that James created, but I'm also a fan of whatever it is they do, so I'm, a little, I guess, starstruck, and you might think that's weird because I haven't had any, stars on my podcast, but to me, they're stars. To me, they're interesting people, and they deserve that, that reverence, that respect. So, because James had that for almost everybody that he ever sat down across and interviewed, the way that I conduct my show in large measure is, I'm indebted to James Lipton for showing me what it's like to be a fan and to use that that fan love, that fan interest to, plug into artistic human beings and help them feel comfortable sharing their stories. So losing an icon like that, at least somebody that I consider to be an icon, such a fixture of the community, because even to watch some of these actors and actresses go on inside the Actors Studio, you could see the reverence that they had for it. It was a renowned a renowned place, and it was an experience for these artists to be invited to do. I just thought I'd share a few memories of my enjoyment of his show. On the Steven Spielberg episode was pretty funny because right out the gate, James usually just starts by, saying all journeys have a starting point, where were you born? And he'll just literally start them from the very beginning of their life. But before he even got into that with Steven, he was just like, he turned to the crowd and he's like, I need you guys to know how bizarre this is, that this is even happening. Because he's like, we've had an invitation out to Steven for years to come on the show, and we've just never heard back from his people. It just hasn't, lined up. And he's like, I was at the movie theater, and I guess some renowned movie theater there in New York or whatever, some specific movie theater, and he was just like, and I was in the popcorn line, and he was talking about how I guess at this particular movie theater, it's got a reputation, you don't mess around on the popcorn line, you know what you want and you get out of there. And he's like, I was just standing in line, I look over, and the next line over, or maybe a few people back or whatever, is Steven Spielberg. And he said that he said hello to him, and Steven said hello to him, and they were both I don't know, I guess just paying compliments and what have you to each other. James is just like, oh, I really loved, your last film, whatever it was. And Steven was just like, I love your work. Are you serious? And James is like, really? Because we wanted to have you on the show. And Steven's like, I would love to come on your show. And James said the funny part about it was that here James Lipton and Steven Spielberg are in the popcorn line at this theater having this conversation, and how usually, again, hustle, bustle, everybody just get in, get out. Everyone around them was just frozen, just in absolute awe at what they were seeing. That these two, again, icons of entertainment, just getting out their calendars and figuring out when Steven Spielberg could come on the show. And him and Steven both had a laugh about that at the beginning of the show. And then he started interviewing him about his career. I feel like that interview was the interview where I heard from Steven. Steven explained that when he was doing E.T., that in that, as a storyteller, what he does is he tries to find a vantage point within the characters to tell the story through or from. With E.T., he wanted to tell the story from Elliot's perspective, and so what he literally did, as often as he could get away with it, is he shot the movie from an angle that would take you down to the perspective of a child, so that you could actually experience the story in a different way. I think that Inside the Actor Studio interviews where I heard that. He talked about when he... I think the way James brought it up is he was talking about the Oscar experience and how after E.T. and Jaws and Close Encounters of the Third Kind and all these great movies, that they finally gave him, the trophy for Schindler's List. And then they had this talk about Schindler's List and how Spielberg, being of Jewish descent, talked about, going into Auschwitz, going into the camps and recreating, these horrors, these atrocities. And he said that he was just constantly in tears, just sobbing, between takes, between scenes, between setups and things like that. And that he would actually call Robin Williams and just say, I'm falling apart, make me laugh. And then Robin would just crack jokes over the phone and just get Steven out of his head and make him laugh. Or the episode where Tom Hanks came on. Tom Hanks actually went on there at least twice. And I want to say it was I don't know which time it was, but he told he's told a lot of interesting stories. Tom's a really interesting guy, but he talked about doing Philadelphia and how one of the things that he learned from that experience is the power of film as a record, as a document, because he's like, if you watch that movie, when they were at the clinics, when his character was getting treatments for the HIV, those were real clinics, real operating clinics, and he said those people that he, was seated next to, between takes and stuff, those were actual people and getting real treatments, and he would talk to them and stuff, and he said even at like the screening of the movie, some of those people that he'd gotten to know and kept in touch with had passed, and Tom just, started crying and said, these films are real, and the people involved are real, and it was a really powerful moment. And he makes some jokes too, like Tom talked about, they talk about Forrest Gump, and I think he said life is like a box of chocolates, you never know what you want to get in Forrest Boys, and he said to James, you just made De Niro say, you talking to me. Like, great Taxi Driver reference. Anyway, remember when Johnny Depp was on there? It was really interesting to see somebody who, at the time, this was like pre-Captain Jack Sparrow. This was, he was a great actor, and he'd definitely done some great work, but he wasn't, like any level of an icon. Well, that's maybe not fair to say. He wasn't to the Jack Sparrow level yet. But to have him on there and have, James just geeking out about, like, Edward Scissorhands, and having Johnny tell stories about, like, James was asking him about his process, like, how do you get to characters? How do you get to something like Ed Wood, or, just any number of stuff that you play? And he's like, usually it's images. He's like, I'll read the script, and I'll be reading what my character's saying or what they're thinking, and then I just get images. And he said I wish I could remember exactly what he said, but he was like, for Edward Scissorhands, it was a combination of, like, this puppy that he had at one point in time and someone else or something else, like the combination of those two, like the innocence, I guess, like, the malleability of that combination, like, is where he got the inspiration to create what we know and love as Edward Scissorhands. A couple of really interesting ones. The one with Angelina Jolie. I don't know exactly where she was in her career at the time, but it was before, like, she directed anything, as far as I know. It was before, like, Salt or some of her later, more iconic work. But she was still, I would say, like, a sexual Hollywood symbol. Like, she was, as far as her roles go, as far as what she has presented and portrayed, and I guess maybe just how American culture, entertainment culture talks about her and interviews and stuff like that. And then she comes on James Lipton's show, and she's just such a sweet human being, such like a quiet, just full of gentle smiles, just the girl next door. And it was so fun to watch her just kind of just melt James. That, like, she's this vivacious, sexy creature on the screen, but then just sitting next to James, like, she's just so kind and thoughtful and smart and, well-spoken. But then also told stories about, like, the time her and Billy Bob Thornton, like, wore each other's blood around their necks and, like, a necklace and stuff. Just really interesting. There was an episode when he had Russell Crowe on, when, I don't know how many times or if he ever did this, but there was, like, an intro before the episode even started with literally just James sitting in front of the camera and being like, I just wanted to give everyone kind of a heads up before this episode starts that, your familiarity with today's guest, Russell Crowe, might be the scandals in, all the entertainment rags, or just the headlines that, have been slopped across news entertainment, or entertainment news, over the last years or decades about Russell and his antics and his romantic life, etc., etc. And he's like, what you are going to meet today is the antithesis of the image that's been created by media. What you're going to meet today is the quietest, gentlest, most introverted artist that you may ever have the privilege of meeting. And then, they roll the episode, and Russell's like just practically like hunched down in the chair, like he's answering all the questions, and he's being super thoughtful, and he's but he's very like sober and very somber and very, very serious. And it was such an interesting angle to the man we know that plays all these incredible characters in films. Speaking of Robin Williams from the Steven Spielberg episode, the Robin Williams episode of Inside the Actors Studio is probably the best one that's ever happened. Genuinely. Like, if you ever seen Robin Williams stand up, like Robin Williams live on Broadway, or I don't know, I guess really just any of it. I mean, the man's a tornado. Or he was, anyway. And when he came on Inside the Actors Studio, I mean, he had this huge body of work to talk about up to that point. And James had so many questions for him, and Robin, being as adorably nervous as he was, James could not contain him. He would ask him a question, and Robin would just spin out and start entertaining the crowd. And if you ever have a chance to watch the Robin Williams episode of Inside the Actors Studio, it's probably the best hour and a half, 2 hours that you'll ever spend in your life. It is, and watching him break James again and again and again, because James was a very refined, I mean, he was a gentle guy, and he was certainly very given to humor and such, but he's the dean of a school, so he's definitely got some elegance to him. But Robin would just break him again and again and again and again, with brilliant bit after brilliant bit after brilliant bit. Ugh, such a good episode. I think my two favorite moments on Inside the Actors Studio, one was on the Jamie Foxx episode of Inside the Actors Studio, which was fun. It was after Ray, so they just had a lot to talk about with the arc of Jamie's career, and Jamie told stories about the way he grew up and how his grandmother had taught him things. He would refer to it as his grandma gave him tools that got put into his backpack, like she put him in piano lessons early as a kid, and initially he was just learning like classical pieces and stuff, and then at some point he'd want to like impress her with just some music that she liked, and she'd be like, well, I love that Lionel Richie, and he learned some of that, and then he tells a story about how in time he was up for the role of Ray, and they were just like, well, we were looking for somebody who plays piano, and he was like, well, I got this tool my grandma gave me. He talks about how she had encouraged him to play football. I guess he was like an All-American quarterback when he was younger or something, and then down the pipeline, I forget which director directed it, but Any Given Sunday, when he was being approached for that role, he talks about how they were just like, well, some of it's just going to be, we're going to have some doubles doing some of the action, but we would like to, get you out there doing some of this action just for continuity so we can see your face in the face mask. And he's like, well, I got this, tool from Grandma. She pushed me into football, so now I have all these gifts and skills. And then at the end of the episode, James says, Jamie came to us today at great personal cost and asked Jamie to explain why. And then Jamie's like, he's put on these like sunglasses and he's just in full on tears and tells the auditorium that I think just a week or two earlier. I think actually what James says is Jamie was supposed to be here a couple of weeks ago, but had to postpone this, but has come to us tonight at great personal emotional expense and asked him to explain it. And Jamie said that the grandma, the one that had helped him get all the things that he would need to live the life that he wanted to live, passed away. And really beautiful, just watching how he said it. And then my second favorite moment, and I feel like it was really fun to kind of see this one, because it was one that I had actually picked up on before it was explained in the episode why it was so special. There was a few episodes. Robert De Niro was one of them. I can't remember the other ones, but basically at the end of each episode, what happens is James does this kind of like what is the guy, Bernard Pivot, this French journalist, used to do these interviews, and he would conduct this particular like questionnaire, I guess you could say. And so James would do the questionnaire at the end of each of these interviews, and then after the questionnaire he would actually turn the actor, director, whoever over to the auditorium and let the students ask questions. And in a few of these, Robert De Niro and one of the other ones, one of the students that stood up was a very young Bradley Cooper, who was a student at the time. And years later, after much film success, Bradley Cooper was invited to inside the actor's studio, and like he just couldn't pull himself together for the first like 10 minutes of that interview. Like he was just in tears about how powerful it was. And they show you clips, like even James was just like, for anybody who doesn't understand why this is special, like Bradley studied here, and he's on a few other episodes of this show. Like he has been such an incredible student, and now here he is, and now here we get to ask him questions. It's really, really powerful. All that being said, again, the host of that show, Inside the Actors Studio, James Lipton, passed away this morning. And I mean, 93 years old is nothing to shake a stick at. He led a long and meaningful life, and is mourned by the rich and swollen, the hearts swollen with gratitude of both audience members like me and so many students and faculty that he got to work with over the years. At the end of the questionnaire, the last question was always, when you die and you get to the pearly gates, what do you hope to hear God say to you? And I'm not sure that anyone ever flipped that question on James, or he's ever on record saying what he hoped God would say to him, but in that we don't know what God would have hoped, what he would have hoped God would have said to him. Maybe we can all just give James Lipton a gentle bow of our heads and thank him for his work by wishing him swift passage to those pearly gates, and may he pass through them into the heaven of all of his dreams coming true. We miss you, James. Thanks for inspiring us and lifting us up so much onto the pedestal of your own fandom.